This episode, I'm joined by Rafael Winkler to discuss his recent Reader's Guide to Slavoj Žižek's The Sublime Object of Ideology. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paying patrons and subscribers for making all this work possible, and if you'd like to support the podcast and keep it running, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Rafael Winkler, thanks very much for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
We are going to be discussing, I guess, in a way, sort of two books. So, in June of this year, you published Žižek's The Sublime Object of Ideology, a Reader's Guide, published by Bloomsbury Academic. So this is, as people will probably imagine, this is a secondary guide to Slavoj Žižek's book, The Sublime Object of Ideology, which was that book. Žižek's book was published in 1989 originally, and it's his first book. Was his first book, and many still say that it is his magnum opus, which is kind of just probably a little bit disappointing for Žižek, considering how much he publishes. But, you know, it's Žižek's beginning, it's the beginning to that, which is Žižekian as well, and it's an extremely intriguing book, of course, but your Reader's Guide, I think maybe I'm wrong in thinking this, but it seems like maybe such a thing was a long time coming? Or how were you approached, or was this something you wanted to write? Oh.
No, it was something that I thought, how can I put it? I first discovered Žižek in 2007 or 2006 when I was doing my PhD thesis at Warwick. And at the time, the fashionable philosopher was Deleuze, and Žižek had a book out on Deleuze, and, well, you know. So that was my first encounter. And then a couple of years later, I was getting into Lacan, and naturally again, Žižek is an avid reader and a great reader of Lacan. And so that was my second time to rediscover Žižek. And at the time, I had already, browsed through The Sublime Object of Ideology, but this second time when I rediscovered Žižek, I thought that actually there is something here that needs a thorough reading and a thorough interpretation. And that was not in 2007. That must have been maybe a year or two before I started to write the book, possibly a year. So that is in 2022. And I thought that the best thing to proceed would be to set up a reading group between some colleagues and myself and some students on this very book, and that's how it all began. And as I started to read more and more the text and acquired better and sounder understanding of what was going on, it struck me as a watershed in critical theory and social theory, especially in relation to the kind of text that we were being taught at the time when I was doing my PhD. I'm talking about authors like Foucault, preeminently in Habermas, Judith Butler. It struck me as providing a radically new critique of society, as well as providing the reader with tools to critique society, right? It's not just a new insight into how society functions, it's also it furnishes us with the means to critically appraise society, contemporary society. So that was really the reason, the motive behind writing this guide. It was really for me to acquire a better understanding of what Žižek was about in that book, what he was trying to achieve. And for me, the best way to do that is simply to write about the author. And so I would provide short summaries of 2,000 words of each chapter or lesser than that, and we would talk about that, and the result is, as you know, the Reader's Guide.
So you said that you felt that the Sublime Object of Ideology needed a thorough reading. Was there anything specific? Can you remember? Was there anything specific that you thought this would be better explained? Like this could have been better explained or expanded upon to make this a bit more accessible?
Well, you see, the way I've been trained to do philosophy is to provide a historical context to an author's statement. And so the historical context here is the Habermas Foucault fad, if you want to call it that, in the 80s. These were the two prominent authors that you would draw on, either the one or the other, to understand what was going on in society at the time in the 80s and in the 90s. And so I tried to provide that kind of background, especially also because at the time, as you know, Laclau and Mouffe are quite important to Žižek, and they were not in mainstream philosophical academia, I think, at least not in the English-speaking world. I mean, obviously they were writing at the time, but they were not, let's say, read as much as Foucault or Habermas. And given the prominence that Žižek gives to these two authors, plus given his, let's say, Lacanian rehabilitation of the Marxist notion of ideology, all of these things at the same time brought something quite fresh, let's say a fresh insight, as well as, a fresh way of tackling critically society, or the society that we are currently in. And there is also that aspect, right? So Foucault and Habermas, they talk of a society that in some respects is still here today, the kind of society that has certain repressive norms. But at the same time, the society that we live in, the word escapes me, the one that Žižek often uses, not a permissive society, that's the word that I'm looking for. The kind of permissive society where you have, as he puts it sometimes, Žižek, enjoy your symptoms. This kind of society is quite new, right? You don't have it. Let's say the structures that would make that kind of society possible were not extant in the 80s, and certainly not in the 70s. And given that Žižek's conceptual tools address that kind of society, the permissive society, it strikes me as a much more, contemporary way of understanding what is going on. And so fresh, and fresh in that respect, and also, like I said, a watershed, right? Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely. And it's what you said there is, I remember my first time reading Sublime Object of Ideology, and what you said there is pretty much mirrors my own experience, which is all at the same time. So it's not just a historical philosophical progression where it's like drawing on others and then one idea is moving us forward, or one change. There is 3 or 4 different things happening all at once. And Žižek's style of writing as well is, I don't want to say haphazard, but it's accelerative and very quick. And I think he's often, he's almost impatient as a writer. And so you mentioned earlier that you're being trained as a philosopher is the putting it in the historical context. And I said this to you in your email. The one thing this guide did for me is to situate the sublime object of ideology. And even though Žižek himself does mention these things, he is pretty impatient. He just wants to get past them to begin doing the philosophy. Whereas you really root this book, and for me, helped me understand it in a much deeper sense in this, beginning with the dialogue between Foucault and Habermas, and then this third, which is Althusser later. But it's a pretty fundamental foundation that you really develop, which is this moving from Foucault and Habermas.
Thank you for saying that. I appreciate that.
So if I can ask you to do so, Foucault, Habermas, and then we'll move to Althusser, which is the sort of beginning of the ideology, but in brief, these 3 steps.
Okay, let me try to do this.
I'm sorry, that's one big question.
No, that's fine. Let's see. So as I said, you can say that you had at the time, and the times being the late 80s, the early 90s, before Derridian deconstruction becomes the predominant conceptual way of approaching critically again forms or institutions that are repressive or regressive. At the time, then you have these 2 poles. You have the Habermasian adherent to the Enlightenment ideal of reason as emancipatory. And on the other hand, you have the Nietzschean moral and political nihilist that you find in the middle or late Foucault, who is suspicious of reason, specifically of its claims to providing ways of emancipating mankind from superstition and prejudices and oppressive institutions. These are pretty much the two sides, if you want, or not the two sides, the two, two authors that you can draw on. Either you do believe in the emancipatory goals of the Enlightenment, or you completely mistrust that. We can go into further detail, but perhaps, I don't know if you want to.
Well, I think because I don't think we need to, because I think Žižek is moving from these. So then we have. Okay.
So fine. So let me perhaps spell out this other issue here that is important to what Žižek is doing in the text. For the adherent to the Enlightenment ideal, it is quite essential to keep a distinction between, on the one hand, the mechanisms of ideology that are oppressive, mechanisms that produce superstition and prejudices and so on the one hand, and this ideologically neutral ground of reason, the ground of critique, right? There must be a distinction between, to use a classical language, appearance and truth, error and truth, right? So if reason is able to aim at the truth, there are deviations of that lead you to appearance. But that distinction between reason on the one hand that aims at the truth and prejudices that fail to, or that subvert reason, is essential. It must stay intact. The adherent to the Nietzschean kind of critique pretty much rejects that distinction between, let's say, again, to use another classical but coextensive distinction, reality and appearance. Mm-hmm. Right? So the adherent to the Nietzschean kind of, critique of modernity is one that rejects that distinction, that you can actually, draw it from what's the word I'm looking for? An ideologically neutral ground, the distinction between truth on the one hand, appearance. It's all appearance. It's all a set of lies. Now, that again is something that you could say Foucault is critiqued about and for. And Habermas, on the other hand, is critiqued for maintaining that distinction, right? Now, the point that I want to make is that, as far as I understand, perhaps it's not so explicit in the Sublime Object of Ideology, but certainly in an essay that precedes it by a couple of months or a year, Žižek does maintain that distinction, right? I don't think that it would make sense, conceptually speaking, to say what he does, that the symbolic order coincides with ideology, unless there was, a difference from that, unless there was, let's say, a non-ideological terrain from which you can critique it. Mm-hmm. So I do think that Žižek is committed to that distinction. Mm-hmm. However, the distinction between ideology and the non-ideological is not the distinction between, say, reason and its deviations. It's not that, as it is for the Habermasian. And also, then it's also not the case that Žižek is simply a follower of Foucault, where it's all ideology, or it's all power, and power is, always understood negatively, even if not as a form of oppression, as it often is for Foucault. But let's not go there. So I think that for Žižek, it is important to maintain the distinction between the ideological and the non-ideological. However, the way he thinks of it is precisely in Lacanian terms, where then the ideological simply is coextensive with the symbolic order on the one hand, and what provides you with a critique of the symbolic order / ideology is the position that you could conceivably take by identifying with the real, or with the drive, or with jouissance. So as you have in Lacan, that distinction between the symbolic and the real. That becomes, if you want, the distinction that Žižek thinks the ideological and the non-ideological in terms of. Mm-hmm. Right? So that itself may pose a problem, right? Because what does it really mean to occupy the position of the real? What does it mean to identify with the drive, right? Yes, in one sense, it is, because to the extent that it is not an aspect of the symbolic order, to the extent that it is not something that can be signified, yes, it is critical of the symbolic order, but it is not the kind of standpoint that the Habermasian has in mind when, say, she thinks that It's the standpoint of reason, where you can critically determine the limits of a certain discourse by means of the principles that a certain discourse or institution is committed to. It's not that at all, right? It's precisely beyond language or at the limit of language. That's what the real is. So the question is, what exactly does it mean to occupy the standpoint of the real as the critical standpoint, as the standpoint where you, as it were, what's the word I'm looking for? Try to delimit the symbolic order, try to show that it is somehow in itself incoherent. Well, it's a difficult question. I'm not sure that there is a straightforward answer. Perhaps it's not something that you can occupy from a first-person standpoint, to the extent that to identify with the drive is precisely to relinquish the first-person standpoint, the standpoint of the ego, of the I, right? Mm-hmm. The id is just not that, right? It's not the ego, right? It's precisely the antithesis to it. And the ego is very much part of the symbolic order. It is very much what is formed by it. It is very much a product of ideology, right? Mm-hmm. So in effect, the standpoint that you would take, that you would conceivably take at the limit of ideology, would be one where you would sacrifice your subject position, one where you would sacrifice your ego, right? And exactly what that means, it's not clear always, right? It's easy to instance it. Antigone is, as you know, one of Žižek's most favorite characters that illustrates this very identification with the drive, one that, an identification that calls into question the symbolic order. In what sense? By exposing its inconsistency, by exposing the impossibility of it, the symbolic order, closing in on itself, being complete, a whole, a harmonious totality, right? It's easy to exemplify it with certain characters in certain stories, but I don't think that is the kind of standpoint that you could erect a political ideology on, a political doctrine or a certain mandate. You know what I mean? That you could somehow erect a list of prescriptions or projects. Okay, so this is what we got to do to dismantle this ideology. It's not that kind of thing. It wouldn't allow for that. It precisely is a non-discursive position, whatever that, it's not as if Antigone says, okay, so let's just dismantle no, she just acts. And her action is, or entails at least two things. On the one hand, the destruction of Thebes, of the entire social order, and on the other hand, her own death, right? So you can't erect a political program on that. You can't erect a political program on this position where you can criticize the symbolic order from. Mm-hmm. That's the difficulty.
Rafael, I am in awe of your articulation there, and I want to sort of step back and then relayer this by, I'm going to throw some abstract stuff at you, because it seems we're talking about, in a way, three triptychs. So we've got id, ego, superego from the psychoanalytical, we could say as the ego is that in-between that is fluxing in between the two. And if I was very hastily to relate these to what we've already spoken about, which is sort of Habermas reason, superego on one side, and we could say the Nietzschean, Foucauldian individual id on the other, the devaluation of all values. And then the reason I talk about another triptych, we've of course got the Lacanian real, imaginary, symbolic. And what I want to throw in here actually is, in this sort of seeming middle way of the ego, I think of, Žižek's own Hegelian influence, and Hegel saying, when he comes across Heraclitus, finally we see land in the history of philosophy. And in Heraclitus, very abstract, but in Heraclitus, or I would also say philosophers of flux, in this in-between space, between these sort of two pillars, one of which is the devaluation of all values, and the other is sort of the most solid Enlightenment reason, could a beginning of a definition of ideology be that which is between the two, like the ego, but is constantly just holding itself as sort of a place of impermanence, caught between the two, and knowingly caught between the two?
Okay, so you're asking me how to think of ideology here. Or I'm not sure.
Well, from the foundation that you have helpfully put in there with the id, ego, superego, I personally see ideology as in that position of the ego, in that strange middle position, and I think that mirrors with Habermas's the superego and Foucault's id, roughly.
Okay, I understand what you mean. I would say that as far as I understand Žižek, both the ego and the superego would be formations of ideological processes. The id would be at the very limit of such processes. And the paradoxical position of that limit is that, well, it's hard for me to put it coherently in words here. What makes it paradoxical, this id, is that it does seem to carry this kind of double duty. On the one hand, look, the best way for thinking about this, it strikes me, is in terms of precisely Žižek thinks of it as a symptom. A symptom largely can be thought of as the site where the id derives a certain kind of enjoyment or satisfaction. So let's say that there are certain wishes or fantasies that society prohibits you from realizing. And so there is an alternative way of finding satisfaction. That's the symptom. And the symptom then is a pathological disorder, right? Where certain id-like satisfaction is nevertheless had in spite of the prohibitions set in place by society. And it's a pathological disorder to which one is attached and from which one cannot free oneself. Now, what makes it paradoxical is the fact that it causes the patient who suffers from it pain. How can you make sense of that? Why do you stay attached to something to a pattern of behavior that causes you pain? Right? Normally, according to the pleasure principle, you avoid pain and you seek out pleasure. But here you have something quite different that is happening. Now, why am I mentioning this? Because for Žižek, and I think he's right about this, ideology is just a pathological symptom. It's just a symptom, right? And you're attached to an ideology just as you are to a symptom. So think of the guy who compulsively washes his hands. He can't free himself from that. In the very same way, one cannot free oneself from the ideological state apparatuses in which one is born. You just remain attached to these as you would to a symptom, even though they cause you pain. Now, so this is the thing, right? So this is one side of the paradox. The other side is that because it is where the id derives or finds satisfaction, it is also the site that testifies to the fact that the symbolic order is in itself incomplete. It is precisely what cannot be incorporated by the symbolic order. A symptom is a remainder of this attachment to the symbolic order that cannot be signified, right? That's just what a symptom is. So at the same time as it attaches you to an ideology, it is also what keeps you at a distance from it, because the symptom or the id that derives satisfaction there in that pattern of behavior cannot be signified by the symbolic order. Hence, it eludes the symbolic order. And so it keeps you away from it. The paradox then is like, it's Janus-faced, right? It, on the one hand, attaches you to the ideology as you would, and it also keeps you at a distance from it. I mean, I think that's the most coherent thing that I can say about it right now at 5:25. So maybe, yeah. But you see what I'm saying, right? It's
which to be human is paradox. To be a paradox.
Yes, and well, that what the very same thing that attaches you to an ideology is also the thing that keeps you at a distance from it, and it allows you to critique it.
Let me add something in just to see if we're on the right lines. And this is something I've repeated in a couple of podcasts since interviewing Todd McGowan, who's sort of Žižek is within his work. Lacan says whenever if my wife is late, she's no longer my wife. And I like to tweak this because I'm from England, and when I'm watching football, right, England always comes second. So if England ever win, they're no longer England, right? So the pain of them losing is that which keeps me involved in that whole dynamic. And if England were ever to win, which I don't even really understand what that would mean, yes, it just doesn't work anymore, right? Like that would mean that the symptom is dissolved. It's quite a coy example, but those kind of examples are throughout life. And so it's that same sort of alienated pain that somehow keeps me involved, even though I would explicitly say, well, actually, no, I want them to win. And so sort of there's a lie, but there isn't.
Well, I mean, let me say two things in response to this. One, I'm not sure that a symptom could ever be dissolved, at least according to Žižek and Lacan. And in this, to the extent that it is not a formation of consciousness or the pre-conscious, but it's a formation of the id. And you simply cannot free yourself from the id. It's just not possible. So if the symptom is a site where the id enjoys itself, then it's there. And so no amount of symbolic mediation, no amount of the talking cue is going to free you from that. The question is how you relate to your symptoms otherwise, in a way that they don't cause you pain. That's one thing that I wanted to say. So that means, more generally speaking, I don't know to what extent it is possible to free oneself from ideology. Because again, if an ideology is just another way of thinking about a symptom, or if the best way to think about an ideology is as a pathological disorder, as a symptom, and you can't free yourself from a symptom, then by implication you can't free yourself from an ideology, right? Which brings about its own problems and questions. But setting that aside for now, the other issue is about this question of pain. And I've thought about how to make sense of this, so in the most concrete way possible. So where does ideology take place, right? It doesn't take place as it does for Marx, when you sell your labor power on the market and you objectify it, right? That's not where we are at with Žižek or with Althusser anymore. When we think of ideology, we are talking about the formation of the subject, right? We are talking about the constitution of the I or of the ego or of the superego in certain rituals and practices and through certain acts, speech acts in particular. Right, that's what ideology, the locus of ideology is the subject, is the constitution of the subject in certain institutions like the school, basically what Foucault is also talking about, but for a reason, because Althusser had just been doing what he was, anyway, to stay on track. So we are talking about the formation of the subject in certain sites like the school, the hospital, through certain speech acts and through certain rituals. Now, I'm thinking I'm 6, 7 years old. I have to go to school and I have to learn certain hymns and whatnot. There's no pain there, right? But that's where, I can't recall specifically the pain of having to go to school. Yes, perhaps in certain ways you can say, I have to leave the home, I have to leave. My mom is saying goodbye to me, or my dad is saying, so there is a certain sign, yes. But I don't think that's really what is at stake here. In becoming a subject, a member of society, right, with certain ideals. I don't think that really that is at stake. I think that it's a much more abstract kind of experience that Žižek and Lacan have in mind. Basically, it occurs at infancy, at the subjection of the infant to the signifier, which perhaps is immemorial. And it perhaps is something that is experienced only retroactively. But that subjection of a human body to language is traumatizing. And that is where ideology begins. And I would say that is where I would locate the pain that we are talking about. And what makes that difficult to, what makes it difficult to think about is because it is so abstract, right? We don't have a memory of, okay, so there's language and there's my body and one meets the other. We don't have a memory of that. But we can certainly conceive that it would be a terrible, horrifying experience for one to meet the other. And I think the attachment of the one to the other, of a body, an infant body to an ideology begins right there.
So are you talking of the mirror stage here?
I'm talking of the mirror stage, yeah. Yeah, you could say that.
So the mirror stage, as you understand Žižek understanding it, the mirror stage is sort of the ultimate moment of, should we say, symbolically selving horror.
not necessarily, right? Because the mirror stage, according to Lacan, begins from the 6th month all the way up. I'm thinking of something even more primal. In the very moment that you're born, there are signifiers there that are flashing, right, in the very operating room, and that's just where it would begin, right? I think that's the scene that Lacan has in mind in the first graph of desire. I mean, he has different ways of thinking about the transition from nature to culture, but it always takes place, or at least what is permanent in all of the graphs is precisely the subjection of the body to the signifier. Why? Because that is exactly where the unconscious is produced, where the difference is produced between consciousness and the unconscious, through the signifier. Without that, you don't yet have anything human or resembling human, right? And that's where I would situate the pain that we are talking about, that would attach the body to a certain ideology.
Do you think also a key aspect of that pain is an eventual understanding that the symbolic, inclusive, of course, of the signifier, is that which has already been going. It's not, it's not some tabula rasa. You are born into that. You're born into that which already is, and so you're sort of not necessarily playing a game of catch up, but you're caught within that which has been going without you and will go on without you. And part of the pain is self-knowledge of that.
Yeah, I mean, consider also the way that psychoanalysis thinks of trauma. I'm thinking in particular of the famous case of Emma that Freud talks about in his 1895 very first description of the unconscious. You have 2 scenes there. You have the very first scene where Emma, at the age, I think, of 8 or 9, she's sexually assaulted by a shopkeeper. And then the second scene takes place when she is, I think, 12 years old. She enters a shop with a friend, and there are 2 shopkeepers there, and they laugh at her, and that triggers her disorder, which is, she's afraid to enter shops alone, right? Where would you situate the trauma? Well, you can't really situate it in the first scene when she's 8, because although she was sexually assaulted, she had no understanding of sexuality. She didn't say that she was sexually abused. There is no indication that she was, that she had anything traumatic happened to her in the first scene. There is no indication. You can't situate it in the second scene either, because she wasn't sexually abused there. Just 2 guys laughed at her. Mm-hmm. So where does the trauma lie? Where does the pain begin? Where does the horror, the incomprehensibility arise? It arises as she remembers the first scene after having acquired an understanding of sexuality. That is to say, just by puberty. So what triggers the horror, the incomprehensibility of an event that took place years ago is a memory, plus an understanding of a certain event. So if there is indeed a traumatism that happens when the body is subjected to language, it would be one that is in a state of latency until much later, right? And the horror and the incomprehensibility of that subjection would come about much, much after. And it would be triggered by certain memories, by inner events, inner psychic events. So again, right, it's when it comes to trauma, you can't trust, what's the word I'm looking for? The linearity of time. The idea that certain effects follow certain causes that precede them in time. You can't trust that anymore because, well, there is a different set of rules at play in the development of certain traumas, and so in the development and the upsurge of certain experiences like pain. In this particular case, we are talking about one's attachment to a certain ideology. So yeah, so it's much more complicated. Yeah.
How does that sort of mirror in ideology? Because the way we would think of ideology is, as the nation state or schooling or the state in general. How does that sort of traumatic effect appear in ideology?
Well, exactly, through symptoms, right? They would be the most conspicuous sites of the failure to integrate the subject fully into an ideology. The symptom would be precisely those sites where ideology fails, right? So the very limit of it. And by ideology, I mean, again, the symbolic order and the way that it attempts to train you, or to train you into becoming a fully integrated member of society, right? With the ideals of society. So consume, produce, pursue your self-interest. The failure of that is normally evidenced in certain symptoms, in certain so-called aberrant behaviors. Criminals, prisons, that's where you find the very limit of society.
Can we ever be fully, purely integrated?
I think that you could say, at least for Žižek, that the fascist regimes have certainly tried to produce that, and you can see the consequences of that, right? So the attempt to produce individuals that are fully integrated leaves horrific kinds of remainders behind, not horrific. Yeah.
And yet,
so no, the answer is clearly no.
And yet, any supposed, as we've spoken about earlier, you can't get rid of the symptom. So what exactly are, let's say, escape attempts? Of course, people might end up in prisons, but there are, let's say, more ironically ideological escape attempts where people have recognized an ideology and they seek to destroy it, but they might be, or they seek to usurp it, or whatever it might be, but they themselves may be ignorant of the fact that they are sort of doing so from just another ideological position. So is it's always, maybe it's a simplistic question, but let's say an escape attempt from one ideology is merely the birth or bolstering of a different ideology?
Not necessarily, right?
Okay.
Because the id is at the limit of all discourse, at the limit of the symbolic order. And if ideology simply is coextensive with the symbolic order, then to the extent that you or your behavior identifies with with the id, then you remain at the very limit of all ideologies, of all symbolic orders. But there was another thing that I wanted to say. This goes back to the earlier point that I made, that to the extent that the escape from ideology, in inverted quotes, to the extent that that is premised upon identifying with the id, you can't pin on that a collectivist political agenda, right? So it's only an ever individualist. There is a certain existential dimension, if you want, in the Žižekian way of thinking about the limit of ideology. And by existential dimension, I mean, exactly that. That is a question of you facing the fact, or being faced with the fact that the society that you're in is inconsistent, is lacking the so-called signified that would bring everything at one with itself in a harmonious totality. I don't know. Maybe today he does think that there are certain collectivist agendas that you can, based on these experiences. I've not followed up the more recent Žižek, but certainly the Žižek of 1989 all the way up to the 2000s doesn't strike me as believing in this, and being close to Heidegger in that respect, or to the existentialists in that respect.
So this sort of takes us right back to the beginning of our discussion, in that, yeah, sure, there may very well be an escape, but in its attachment, in the fact that it is of the id, let's say, it can't be conscious, it can't be reasoned. So as soon as you enter into that realm of reason, you get caught in the bind of ideology.
Yes, but again, I mean, conscious, I don't know that this term is of much pertinence at this level. I think of Antigone. She was very well aware of what she was doing, right? That she embodies, at least in my understanding of what Žižek is doing with her, she embodies the id. Her agency is that of the id, and that's what drives her to call into question, the dictates legislated by her uncle, which is to say the dictates of Thebes, the social order. Right. And I think that she's very well aware that she's going to her death, and that's what she must do. So that's why I'm saying that even though let's say that it's not a fictional character, right? I think that it's very possible to be aware of what you're doing. Maybe not that you're driven by the id, but certainly you're aware of doing it. And that your action does call into question the social order by exposing its lack, by exposing the impossibility of it being a totality, or reaching or achieving or realizing a totality.
As Žižek himself loves to use films, would you, I don't know if you've seen the film Falling Down, would you consider that an example of the id as an escape attempt?
Yes. Look, I mean, what strikes me every time when we talk about the id is that it behaves very much like the Kantian moral agent. That is to say, you're responsive to an unconditional imperative, one that, in other words, you ought to follow without question and regardless of the consequences. So if the imperative says go and satisfy your urge, you just do it regardless of your welfare, regardless of the welfare of others. To the extent that it is unconditional, it precisely is something that escapes signification, right? Signification is based upon understanding one thing on the basis of another. Signification is something conditional, right? You understand one thing in terms of something else. And an unconditional demand, like the way in which the id behaves, is precisely beyond the symbolic order. It's incomprehensible. And when someone behaves like that, well, they provoke a certain sense of awesomeness or shock or sublime, right? Because their behavior is unintelligible. And this doesn't have to be something grandiose like Antigone. It can be seen in the way that a child throws a tantrum in a supermarket because they want something. But eventually what they want is not, the toy, because even when you give them the toy, they still are throwing the tantrum, right? So there is something incomprehensible. The id is basically alive and kicking, so to speak. There is something unconditional that is displaying itself there. And that is precisely to the extent that it is... beyond language or at the limit of language. It's at the limit of the symbolic order / ideology. And that into question. That's just enough for it to call.
So thus far, and of course, in asking you this, I myself am caught up in, let's say, an ideological projection of how things should be. But do you consider this defeatist / pessimistic?
Can you say more? What do you mean?
Well, we can't get rid of the symptom. Yeah. We are always caught up in ideology. The self is caught in the middle of a process that is going on beyond us and was there before us. And these escape attempts are quite literally, if they were legible, then they wouldn't be true escape attempts. But the fact of their unintelligibility means we can't, as you said, no collectivist action, maybe in Žižek's later work, but no ability to sort of rein these in. Is this pessimistic? Or is it is?
I think it's pessimistic only if you're already committed to the idea that the world is meaningful. I don't think it is. I think that if you start from the position where there is no meaning, that meaning is an effect of signifiers and of their differences, and that we are simply animals emitting sounds, there's no reason why you would be led to believing, that on the contrary, I would say that, there is nothing that there is no reason for you not to bring about change, to bring about destruction. In other words, let me put it like this, right? To say that if you're committed to the view that there is a meaningful world out there, then you are most likely committed to the view that there is a real difference between a right and a wrong, a good and an evil. I don't think that is true. If you take away the view that the world is meaningful, then you also take away the ground on which you can say there is a real difference between an absolute good and an absolute evil. I don't think, so if you get rid of that, there is no reason to be a pessimist.
Okay.
Do you understand what I'm trying to say? You're a pessimist only if you think, well, there was a meaning and now there isn't. But if you don't think there ever was such a thing, and if you think, on the contrary, that meaning is simply the effect of differences between sounds, well, great.
I absolutely understand. That's why I said I was caught up in ideology by posing the question.
So, I don't think it leads to pessimism. I think that, on the contrary, there is still today too much commitment to the idea that the world that we live in is rational and meaningful. That's just in part what ideology is about. We not only are we convinced of the fact that what we do is meaningful, but that it will lead to some meaningful end. I mean, that's us. Because it just isn't the case. We're born, we die, and that's it. There's nothing more to it.
But we haven't fully taken the leap, and perhaps that's just because we're caught. Maybe some people have, maybe some people haven't. But that's perhaps because we're caught in a certain point in the signification chain, which later down the line we will eventually get past. But we're caught, I think, and this is just a key topic for me that I think is really important about our position as humanity, whatever that is at this point in time, which is cynical reason. And so, in relation to ideology, we have got to this point with respect to we could say, as our individual subjects, where we're familiar with people like Foucault and Nietzsche so much now that there is a devaluation of values. There's an ideology which in itself contains its own deconstruction. Yes. So the cynical reason of we know we are in ideology has itself become, I would say, that postmodern hegemony, right? So where do you go from that? Because then you end up getting caught in a it's ideology critiquing ideology.
This reminds me, there is another reason why I was so drawn to that book, to the Sublime Object of Ideology, as well as to other parts of Žižek's texts in that time. At the time, again, in the 90s and the early 2000s, and obviously in the 80s and the 70s, the progressive figure was the pervert. That is to say, the homosexual, for example, or the transvestite who simply called into question the norms of society by behaving otherwise and by exposing their contingency and their particularity, by precisely behaving against the norm, right? So the progressive type at the time was the pervert. I think that Žižek is absolutely spot on and brilliant in showing, well, that's just part of the reigning ideology, right? You're not at all being transgressive or subversive by acting as a pervert, by acting as, cross-dressing or whatnot, right? No, on the contrary. So in that feeds into what you were just saying right now. So the cynic is he's a moral or political nihilist, right? He's the kind of person whose default position is irreverence, is to call into question the status of things, the status quo, is someone who doesn't want to be duped by the system, someone who can see through the bullshit, right? The cynic is the educated man, every man, right, who can see through the bullshit, who doesn't think twice on seeing some guy wants, to be the next president. He's after in his own interest. He's not really after the common good, right? And so the biggest crime for that position is sincerity, believing at face value what you're being told. All of this is, again, part of ideology. And what's interesting is Žižek's analysis of Sloterdijk's cynical consciousness, which, according to Sloterdijk, is indeed the dominant way of thinking about the world today, right? In other words, realizing that there is no substance to things, that everything is an image and deception and lie, right? Žižek shows that actually, yes, that's true, but at the same time, the cynic does need certain others to believe sincerely. Otherwise, he wouldn't have any grounds for being a cynic, right? Mm-hmm. And I tried to illustrate this in a passage that I found in what's his name, White Noise by
Don DeLillo.
Don DeLillo, that's right. You have the encounter between the main protagonist and at the end of the story, and a nun that takes care of him. He's just been wounded, and he's at a loss when he hears that the nun doesn't believe in the ideological claptrap that she has been, professing, namely angels and demons, heaven and hell. She says to him, "This is all nonsense. I believe for your sake." Right? I believe so that you can be a cynic and an atheist and disbelieve. In other words, the point that Žižek was making, and this is what I'm trying to say here, is that the cynic can sustain her position to the extent that she projects in certain others the beliefs that she disavows. Mm-hmm. Right? So cynicism is not opposed to ideology. On the contrary, cynicism and ideology go very well together. Right. So you can say, well, I don't believe in all this nonsense, but that is as long as you have the Vatican out there that's maintaining those very beliefs that you, again, are cynical about. One and the other are part of the same symbolic order, if you want. One requires the other. And so he says, well, then the subversive position in this situation would obviously not be one of irreverence, because everyone is irreverent. Everyone, and like I said, you can only be irreverent if you project those disavowed beliefs on others. So the one way in which you can then call into question those very beliefs is by identifying too closely or over-identifying with those very beliefs that, you project on others. So take people at their word. or take the institution in its word, and that might bring it to its limit. That might say, hey, actually, hold on, really? Anyway, I mean, that's I think that's one way of approaching this issue. I hope this makes some sense.
Absolutely makes sense. But I think of, it's maybe DeLillo's doing a lot more in that book than I first thought, because my favorite passages from White Noise is the world's biggest barn.
Yes.
And there's the Tegmar, so there's the biggest barn in the world empirically, and then no one goes there because it's the old barn. Then they put a sign on the side of the road that says, you're coming up to the world's biggest barn, which turns it into basically an ideology. So using that as a metaphor, what is to be done? Do we go there and just enjoy the barn, or for knowing all of this and then occasionally say, do you actually really why did you come see this barn? Do you actually like the barn? Is that the best way to bring that fast down? Or should we just enjoy the barn?
Maybe I think that's the best way to enjoy the barn, yes.
Okay. One thing I want to get your opinion on, because Žižek, in his book, he uses Titanic. He loves the Titanic, both the real event and the film. He uses it as the event of the unconscious, sort of, lying down there that we all know about, the wreckage of reason. Do you think we even need to move beyond the Titanic as that event, or do you think we have a more contemporaneous unconscious event that we're all connecting to?
Again, I'm not sure that it's so much what the Titanic represents as the fact that it embodies a site where the id enjoys itself, or finds enjoyment. It's an objectification of the id. The Titanic is, or at least thinking of it as a signifier or as an image, right? And to the extent that it is an objectification of the id, it is senseless. It is what Lacan refers to as a symptom, a certain sign that has been stripped of its signifying function to the extent that it objectifies something asignifying, to the extent that it represents something that doesn't represent anything, right? So it's a paradoxical kind of... the equivalent of that, would be, I imagine, for Žižek, and he's talked about this, another kind of apocalyptic event, right? Because the Titanic did, at the time, signify whatever else it may have signified, the end of a certain age, the age of empire, right? So I would think that the equivalent of that would be whatever would signify what we have in a way somewhat experienced, I think, in 2009, the closure of society. I mean, the financial meltdown, where you can't go to the bank to claim any money, you can't, as a result, purchase anything, you can't get your salary. In other words, society breaks down as a result of the meltdown of the financial sector, which is pretty much the heart of society. Or alternatively, that kind of silent death that we all, at some level, think about when we think about viruses, right? Like the one we just experienced, as it were, yesterday. I'm talking about, what's it called?
COVID?
Yeah, exactly. There we go. Yeah, so something similar, but, of a much more apocalyptic nature, right? So it wouldn't put maybe a certain small percentage of the population in the hospital, but a much larger percentage. So one of these silent killers, if not a physical virus, a digital virus. One or the other, right? That would cause that kind of damage. The end of society.
Do you not think that after both, to use both of those events, so financial meltdown and COVID, do you not see that after both of those we craved our symptoms even harder? Because I thought that COVID would be a rupture that allowed more people to perhaps explore their own freedoms or whatever it might be, even though Žižek's just written a book on freedom. And with the financial meltdown, you'd think people would learn empirical lessons, and yet here we are mucking around with mortgages and whatever it is again. And so do you think these ruptures kind of, once again, this is my own language, but pessimistically, the first thing we do is we don't use it as a means for something new. We actually double down on wanting the return of our familiar symptom.
Well, certainly the last event, namely the one that we talked about, what is surprising about it is the speed at which the state simply intervened with such force, including military force. I mean, that was something quite unprecedented, right, in decades. And I think that perhaps bespeaks, a fear, or I don't know, a certain unconscious fear at something else that may have, the population taking the streets, as it were, and saying, hey, let's just bring something very different about. As for the meltdown, I think that it's far too complicated for me to be able to answer, because we are talking about, economic systems that I do not have the expertise to say much about. In terms of what possible consequences may have fallen out aside from the ones that we have witnessed, namely where the taxpayers made to account for. So I don't know. I can't answer that.
So I guess what's to be done then is just to enjoy our symptom.
Well, perhaps to find different and perhaps more bearable ways of living with them. Because we enjoy we enjoy our symptoms one way or the other, right? And we can hate ourselves for that, or we can relate to ourselves differently for that. And I think the question would be precisely, what better ways are there to enjoy our symptoms, right?
Mm. Is there anything you'd like to add about your guide or sublime object of ideology that you feel is key?
No, I mean, except for just read it when you are reading Žižek's The Sublime Object of Ideology. I think that you will find it helpful, and that's what it was written for.
Are you working on any more guides, or are you all Žižek'd out for the time being?
Yeah, I'm writing now on Spinoza, among other things.
Yeah, that seems like a good place to finish up. I'll be sure to put the links for the book in the description below. But Rafael Winkler, thanks very much.
Thanks very much for your invitation. Thanks.